The next world war is not far away. Foreign affairs. The world is in danger of being destroyed by interrelated conflicts which may coalesce into a single. The post-Cold War era began in the early 1990s with the rather naive, as it turns out, vision of world peace. It ends 3 decades later with growing risks of a new world order. World Affairs warns, estimating that a large-scale international conflict may not be far away. And already the war fronts are many and hot. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought to the heart of Europe its most destructive military conflict in generations, a brutal battle between Israel and Hamas spreading death, sowing seeds of instability across the Middle East. East Asia is not at war, but it is remaining at the fastest rate it's rearming fastest rate in the decades. And if many do not realize how close the world is to being destroyed by violent interconnected conflicts, perhaps it's because they have forgotten how the last World War came about. And Foreign Affairs explains the Second World War and the uncomfortable parallels. And when we talk about World War II often comes to mind, which developed into a bloody battle between rival alliances of the planet, but it was not like that from the beginning. World War II began as 3 separate, loosely connected conflicts for primacy in key regions stretching from Europe to the Asia-Pacific. Conflicts that eventually culminated and coalesced into a massive conflict. The history of this period reveals the darkest aspects of strategic interdependence in a turbulent world. It also draws uncomfortable parallels to the situation facing Washington right now. The United States does not face a formal alliance of adversaries as it once did during World War II. They probably won't see a repeat of the scenario in which authoritarian powers conquer giant swaths of Eurasia and its littorals. However, with wars in Eastern Europe and the Middle East already raging, and ties between revisionist states growing tighter, all it would take is a flare-up in the contested zones of the Western Pacific for another grim scenario to emerge, in which intertwined regional conflicts spark a global security crisis evokes memories of the 1940s. A world in danger and instability could very quickly turn into a world at war, Foreign Affairs reports, adding that the United States is unprepared for the challenge. American memories of World War II are indelibly marked by 2 elements. First, the United States entered the war very late, more than 2 years after Hitler shocked Europe by invading Poland, and more than 4 years after Japan began the Pacific War by invading China. Allied powers versus Axis. Second, the United States was involved in both war fronts simultaneously. The conflict was globalized from the moment the Americans entered it. From December 1941 onwards, the conflict featured a multi-continental coalition, the Allied powers trying to fend off another multi-continental coalition, the Axis, on multiple fronts. The exception was that the Soviet Union remained at peace with Japan from 1941 to 1945. This was a world war in its fullest, most comprehensive sense. However, history's most terrible conflict did not begin that way. Epidemic of global immunity. World War II was the accumulation of 3 regional crises: Japan's attack on China and the Asia-Pacific, Italy's quest for the empire in Africa and the Mediterranean, and Germany's mania for hegemony in Europe and beyond. Somehow, these crises were always connected. Each was the result of an authoritarian regime with a penchant for coercion and violence. Each involved a mania for dominance in a globally important region. Each contributed to what U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt in 1937 called a widespread epidemic of world lawlessness. Even so, this was not a complete major conflict in the first place. What brought the fascist forces together? Fascist forces initially had little in common except illiberal governance and a desire to shatter the status quo. And indeed, the vicious racism that permeated fascist ideology could work against the cohesion of this group. Hitler once taunted the Japanese with racial slurs about their characteristics. And although these countries beginning in 1936 would seal the series of overlapping security pacts. By the late 1930s, they were as often adversaries as allies. Hitler's Germany and Prime Minister Benito Mussolini's Italy cooperated and clashed in multiple purposes and crises. By 1938, Germany was supporting China in its war of survival against Japan. Only gradually did regional crises coalesce and rival coalition coalesce due to factors that many sound familiar today. They may sound familiar today. The revisionist forces of today, what united the Axis powers? They sought a dramatically transformed world order. The revisionist forces of today, as then, do not always have common goals. Russia and China, for example, both seeking supremacy in Central Asia. They are also pushing in the Middle East in ways that sometimes harm Iran's interests, and whether they will overcome differences to unite against the common enemy, the US, or end up clashing with each other, no one can say for sure. However, for now, their ties seem to be strengthening, and Eurasia's regional conflicts are becoming increasingly intertwined. And this I've translated from a Greek article. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.